Hello everybody, and welcome to this latest video on the American Civil War, in which I looked at the causes of the Civil War, the actual course of the war itself, and now the stage we're at is looking at the consequences. The big period that followed the American Civil War was Reconstruction, and today we're looking at a particular element of Reconstruction in that we are looking at resistance to it. And the group who resisted Reconstruction referred to themselves as Redeemers. Now, Redeemers is a very controversial term. In the context of what we're looking at, in Southern politics in the period of Reconstruction, redemption, as they saw it, referred to the overthrowing or defeating of radical Republicans, both white and black Republicans, by white Democrats, marking an end to the Reconstruction era in the South. And that's what white Democrats wanted to do. They wanted to end the whole idea of Reconstruction and the direction of travel it was taking towards greater black rights, black votes, etc. It has kind of biblical allusions. It seems to be taking on almost a religious context with the use of the language that they're doing, this is partly to do with the Southerners' view that the Republican state was both inefficient and corrupt, and there is also this strong racialist element in this, that they're looking to re-establish white control, and they see what's been imposed to them is being done by people coming from the north and invading the south and imposing their way of life and their values on them, and they want to get rid of all of this. Quite clearly, for the black population in the southern states, this is not redemption. This is a move that leads to an onslaught of racial prejudice and violence, and then leads into the period after Reconstruction, which is often referred to as the Jim Crow era, where we see segregation and a great deal of racial discrimination. Redemption, or the groups of redeemers, came in different forms, and some of it was the straight kind of politics of it, where Democrat candidates standing and saying that they opposed black suffrage and they wanted to reduce the role of the state, and they thought the federal government should keep its nose out of the South and things like that. But it wasn't just Democrat politicians that were redeemers. We also see it through violent groups. Now, the most notorious of these was the KKK, and they were created in 1865 by a group of 6 former Confederate soldiers. One of the early leaders was Nathan Bedford Forrest, and he claimed in 1870 that the membership of the KKK was over 500,000. Now, it's very difficult to kind of collaborate this view, because the KKK was not centrally controlled. It's a rather loose collection of local groups that largely did their own thing. They largely did the same thing, which was attacking the black population and anybody who showed sympathy towards them or supported the Republican government. But there wasn't a central kind of controlling arm, particularly, we don't think. The KKK used violence against the black population, all those who were sympathetic towards them, in an attempt to reverse the changes that had been brought in by Reconstruction. So they wanted to reverse the black vote, they wanted to reverse black education, they wanted to destroy the Freedmen's Bureau, and they often would attack Freedmen's Bureau's agents, and they would attack black schools, and they particularly focused on trying to prevent black population voting and other Republican supporters from voting, because it was the Republicans they saw as the enemy, and they had supporters in key areas of law enforcement, the judiciary, and politics, and a large part of the white population wouldn't speak out against them, partly through fear and possibly partly through the fact that they supported their ideas that they were standing for, and a lot of the black population wouldn't speak out because of fear and intimidation, which is exactly what the KKK were aiming for. Now, their members would wear hoods and robes, and you might well have seen images of this, and they would often attack people at night. Members killed and injured people. I mean, the scale of this is almost unbelievable, but it was horrendous. The Reconstruction era is often referred to as the Second Civil War, because there is so much violence and death in the South. One example is that in the 2 weeks before the presidential election in 1868 in Louisiana, there were 2,000 people killed or injured by the KKK and similar groups. Voter suppression was their key aim, in particular the suppression of the black vote. Now, the federal government did respond, and I've looked at this in a previous video which concentrates on Grant's presidency, where he brought in the Force Acts, and Grant brought these in to try and smash the Klan, to disrupt it, and he saw that local law enforcement wasn't working, so he tried to use the power of federal government, and it was largely effective against the KKK, but other groups sprung up. One of the worst examples of the violence in this period is the COLFAX massacre of 1873. The White League rose in Louisiana in response to President Grant sending in federal troops. There was a much debated election in 1872. Louisiana actually ends up with 2 separate governments, a Democrat one and a Republican one, and Grant had sent federal troops in to support the Republican government from this disputed election. There was fear that the White League were going to take control of the regional government in Grant Parish, and so a black militia took control of the courthouse to defend it. The White League and KKK, a large group of armed men, then attacked the courthouse. They had men on horseback, they had rifles, they even had a cannon. And they proceeded to massacre the black militia even when they surrendered. A lot of people were shot, others were hanged. 9 men were finally charged with breaking the Force Act, and it appeared that the best route was to take them to federal court, but they were taken to federal court and they were acquitted. And this seemingly gave the green light for white violence against the black population in the South. So this is a really kind of terrible day in the history of Reconstruction. In context of what's going on, we've got the crisis of 1873. This is a really bad economic depression started by the collapse of railroad stock, and it led to mass unemployment, economic suffering. There's a huge glut of cotton in the South. International markets aren't demanding it. The North really starts to look inward rather than outward, so it tends to focus on its own economic problems rather than worrying about the plight of the black Americans in the South. And it also in the South gave the Democrats the ability, and in the North as well, gave the Democrats the ability to point the finger at Grant's administration and go, the economy's shot, it's his fault. And therefore, rather than on the legacy of the Civil War, if people started to vote based on economic issues, then the Democrats started to see a bit of a swing in the vote. Now, there was a continuation of the violence in the final years of Reconstruction. We see the red shirts, they're a group who originate in Mississippi and spread to South Carolina, for example. Here, where they're essentially terror units working on behalf of the Democrat Party, and they make themselves visible, and they threaten Southern Republicans, and they'd be seen around voting bases with heavily armed. Now, one of the best examples of this was their support for Wade Hampton during the gubernatorial election in 1876 and 1878. And they were one of several kind of paramilitary organizations. You've got the White League in Louisiana, and these are the military arm, essentially, of the Democratic Party. Their job is to suppress the votes of Republicans, and at this they prove to be very, very effective. So there are groups engaging in violent acts of terrorism. The red shirts and the White League set themselves up as rifle clubs, and they worked as essentially vigilante groups, and we see the re-emergence of the KKK later on. And they intimidate people, and so they would be there. They go, well, we're a rifle club, and we just happen to have our meeting here next to the voting station, and we'll all have our rifles out, and we'll look rather threateningly at anybody who's going to come and we think going to vote other than the way that we want them to. And this is about restoring white supremacy in the South and Democrat supremacy in the South. and it again, it shows us how Reconstruction was undermined and fails to a degree. So the South being redeemed, this is the idea that about the Democrats regaining control of the South. And we see this starts to happen kind of state by state. So North Carolina in 1870, Georgia in 1871, Texas in 73, Arkansas and Alabama in 74, Mississippi in 75, South Carolina in 76, and then Florida and Louisiana in 1877. So slowly the Republican control of state governments across the South is ending. And in that, the real chance of a meaningful and lasting legacy from Reconstruction goes, because what these Democrat governments start to do is they start to undo the good work that has been done in Reconstruction. Now, they sell themselves on the fact that they're going to reduce taxes and they're going to reduce the size of government, and that's the beginning part of what they're looking at. But the other major thing they're looking to do is to remove any political power that the black population in those states has made, and also to attack the economic and social progress that they've made as well. There are several events which help this this kind of sad movement. As well, we see the Amnesty Act of 72, and 150,000 ex-Confederates get their rights back, and so this gives a huge bolster to those who are trying to end Reconstruction. Also in 72, the Freedmen's Bureau collapses, and then in 1874, the Freedmen's Bank collapses. And in all of this, we're seeing a change in momentum in the South, a movement away from Reconstruction and towards Reconstruction's end. So what motivated the Redeemers? Well, the first and most obvious one is the racist attitudes. We see this because of the introduction of things like black codes, and we see this both through the introduction of voting clauses, such as the grandfather clause. They're deliberately aimed at suppressing the black vote and getting round the 15th Amendment. We see this through what I've talked about through the video, the violence of these paramilitary groups like the KKK and the Red Shirts and the White League. We see lynchings and murders and intimidation. We see the need for the federal government to bring in Enforcement Act. We see the need for military occupation. And you can say, well, all of this is a race issue. This is about white Southerners trying to reassert their dominance through violence, and so that's why they want to, in inverted commas, redeem the South. Another possible motivation why people may have supported the ending of Reconstruction in the South, and the removal of Republican governments and replacing them with Democrat ones, was the economic problems. So this crisis of 73 was very, very significant. We saw state banks closing, we saw bankruptcies, we saw huge problems for manufacturing and industry and plantations as bankers demanded the payment of their debts. There was an alarming number of foreclosures and bankruptcy. The prices of manufactured goods plunged. Inflation rose rather dramatically. Food and things like that became really expensive. Money supply kind of dried up as the banks were going under. There was no credit available because the banks had gone under, and thousands of Americans lost their jobs and also lost their homes. There's 18,000 businesses that failed between 1873 and 1875. Nearly 1 in 8 Americans became unemployed, and then employers that were still in business to try and cut their costs cut wages. So this has a couple of major impacts. First of all, you can see, well, this might be a motivation for why people voted Democrat rather than racial politics. Also, it means it destroys the will in the North to really push ahead or continue to push ahead with Reconstruction. Right, other motivation for Redeemers, people trying to regain control for the Democrats in the South, was the accusations of corruption. A lot of this was against unpopular groups in the South, the carpetbaggers, who were Northerners who had gone south following the Civil War, and scallywags, who were Southerners who supported the Republican Party. And these are two very unpopular groups with the Democrats for fairly obvious reasons. So they were accused of corruption. But there was also corruption seen at a kind of federal level. There's a lot of accusations of corruption against Grant's administration. We've got the Credit Mobilier crisis in 72. And well, we've got stockholders being cheated out of millions of dollars. and we see this linked all the way through to Grant's very own Vice President COLFAX. So we see the Craig Mobier thing damages Grant and makes his administration look corrupt, as does the whiskey ring, which takes part in '75. Which involves the president's private secretary, Orville Badcock, which is just a great name, and he's seen as filing false reports and cheating the government out of millions of dollars of tax revenue, where essentially they didn't count all the barrels of whiskey, they just counted some of them, and therefore they had to pay less tax on the whiskey. Now, it's never proven that Grant himself was involved in any of these misdeeds or any of this corruption, but his party and his administration really suffer because of these accusations of corruption. So you can see this is another reason why people might talk about redemption for the South in removing Republican corruption. Now, there are some other things that are put forward. This idea of home rule, which is similar to the pre-war idea of states' rights. And this is basically an idea the Democrats put forward, that essentially the Republican Party is a northern party and should refrain from interfering in southern affairs. And it links in, I think, with a lot of the racial ideas at the time. Now, there is a pledge by some Southern Democrats that they would recognise the civil and political equality of the black population if just the Republicans would leave them alone. They didn't subsequently carry that out, which links back to the argument about racial prejudice being one of the key motivating factors, because we see following this period, we see Jim Crow and segregation across the South. Now, another possible motivation for the actions of this group is they wanted to resist northern military occupation. So they, again, one of the reasons why it's referred to as the Second Civil War, because the Reconstruction Act of 1867 meant that the South was formally under military control, divided into these 5 districts, and this caused a huge amount of resentment, and that is what some of the groups like the KKK and the White League and the Red Shirts said they're fighting against. We're fighting against occupation. We're fighting to remove the military presence, and that when the whole thing comes to an end, that's one of the key demands when we see the compromise in 1877 is the removal of the military occupation of the South. But of course, the South has only been required to be under military occupation because of the violence and intimidation by groups like the KKK. Right, I hope that's been really helpful for you. It's giving you an idea of resistance to Reconstruction and the measures taken to undermine it and to fight against it. So it's always a difficult thing, I think, to look at from a modern point of view, because it's very difficult to get your head around why people would have these attitudes. And it does very sadly bring us face to face with some really, really ugly racism and some really unpleasant actions. But it highlights the difficulty that those who wanted to carry out Reconstruction were facing, and gives us some insight into ultimately why it comes to an end. I hope you've liked that video. If you have done, please like it. If you haven't subscribed to the channel already, please do. There's lots of videos on this topic and on other topics in both history and politics. Thank you very much for watching.